There are few things that churn the stomach quicker than National Socialism, better known as Nazism. It was an openly racist ideology that slaughtered over 20 million minorities and started a war that killed a further 80 million when handed the reins of power. It's truly disgusting stuff. And yet, despite the abject horror it spawned and the absolute zenith of evils that it represents, something is undeniably fascinating. It was just so different to anything that anyone born in the post-war world had ever experienced. Because of this intrinsic fascination, and despite it being dead and buried, you can't move without spotting Nazism in our modern world on TV, on social media, video games, books, political debates. At times it feels as though you could scarcely go a day without being reminded of the loathsome ideology. Now, you would hope that its pervasiveness in our culture would at least lead to us having a good understanding of it. But alas, no. That's not the case. And instead, a peculiar juxtaposition exists in which Nazism, one of the most heavily discussed ideologies, is also one of the least understood. And we're aiming to do our small part to right that wrong. And what you've just clicked on is going to be a pretty extensive effort to document and discuss the entire history of Nazism from its very start right to its very end. Oh, and just as an important aside, before we begin, we're going to be referring to Nazism in the past tense throughout this video. And yes, we know the ideology isn't exactly dead, as a few interesting types continue to identify with it, but given the fact that those sorts have basically no influence in the real world, and that the vast majority of people are quite happy to just write them off as a few fringe nutters, we see no reason to validate them by referring to their ideas in the present tense. Nazism is, in real terms, a debunked and dead belief system, and that's exactly how we're going to treat it, so let's begin. Now, before we get into the nitty-gritty of Nazism, let's get something that's both fundamental and very, very contentious out of the way first. Is Nazism left-wing or is it right-wing? And this matter has been something of a political football ever since Hitler ever so kindly decorated the walls of the Führer bunker with his own grey matter in 1945. And as a result, it feels as though it is a question that you are never more than a few clicks away from in today's highly charged political landscape. But unfortunately for people such as us who are just trying to seek an objective understanding of Nazism as an ideology, while it is a question that is highly discussed, it is also a question that is badly discussed, and as invariably those who raise this question in the media are rarely impartial scholars seeking to get to the truth of the matter. Instead, they tend to be partisan political actors who care not for reality but simply to see the other team painted as the baddies, and thus they will manipulate and contort reality to do just that. And that leaves us, the humble sorts, just interested in, truth as something of a miss for what to think or believe. So with that in mind, what's the reality of the matter? And in answering that, sadly, the first thing we must do is explain that this is a highly subjective matter, and so we cannot simply answer it in a word, and instead we must present the different perspectives to you and allow you to form your own conclusion on the matter, with the two perspectives we will use being the contemporary scholarly perspective and the opinions of the Nazis themselves. As for the scholars, they're pretty unanimous in their agreeing that Nazism is an ultra-right, far-right, or extreme right-wing ideology, and there is an endless amount of thinkers we could cite in support of this claim. But to typify the consensus, let's cite Gary B. Rush, who wrote the following in his 1963 paper, Toward a Definition of the Extreme Right, and we're quoting him here. The extreme right is a militant and millenarian political ideology espoused by numerous right-wing groups and individuals, which maintains as an ideal the principle of limited individualism and opposition to modern social principles and modern social structure and opposition. Nazism certainly fits this definition, and thus the scholarly consensus is seemingly accurate in denoting it as a far-right ideology. And to give you a little idea of how it fits, allow us to present you with this extract from an interview Hitler had with the American Monthly in October 1923, specifically after being asked, "What would you do with the Jew?" And we're quoting in here, "We would disenfranchise him, even if he is born in Germany, because birth in itself is no sufficient qualification for citizenship. Citizenship depends upon a clear recognition of the duties implied in its rights. The Jews are not German, they are an alien people in our midst and manifest themselves as such. The fact that a man is decent is no reason why we should not eliminate him." Here we quite clearly see that limited individualism that Rush mentioned, as in this extract, Hitler is very clearly putting German citizenship and the rights and freedoms it affords behind a sort of paywall, the payments of which to pass through is Hitler's own subjective definition of Germanness and subservience to the state, the leader of which we know he envisaged as being himself. As for the opposition to modern social principles and structures that Rush outlined as defining characteristics, let us demonstrate Hitler's holding of them by having a look at his views on women and modern art, both of which have had and still do have their role in society massively dictated by modern social principles and structures. On the matter of women, Hitler said the following in Mein Kampf, the autobiographical ideological manifesto he published in 1925, which we're going to be citing a lot in today's video. Prostitution is a disgrace to humanity and cannot be removed simply by charitable or academic methods. Its restriction and final extermination presupposes the removal of a whole series of contributory circumstances. The first remedy must always be to establish such conditions as will make early marriages possible, especially for young men, for women are, after all, only passive subjects in this matter. So, from that extract alone, we can see that Hitler wasn't exactly pro-sex worker, to put it mildly, and thus, evidently, he was rather opposed to modern social principles, as they would call for sex workers to be afforded dignity and respect. Further to that, the extract also shows us Hitler's views on marriage, that women are only passive subjects in the matter. Fair to say then that Hitler had rather regressive views of women generally, further strengthening the idea that he was opposed to modern social principles and thus meets Rush's definition of far right. And just to really drive this point home, let's also have a look at this quote from Hitler's Table Talk, a collection of his personal musings published by his private secretary Martin Bormann, quoting again, "I detest women who dabble in politics, and if their dabbling extends to military matters, it becomes utterly unendurable. In no section of the party has a woman ever had the right to hold even the smallest post." So yeah, fair to say Hitler wasn't exactly a feminist, and thus we have quite compelling evidence to begin speculating that he was opposed to modern social principles. But let's not take it as a given from this one element of his beliefs alone, because after all, that might just be a fluke, right? Maybe he was quite the modern and progressive fella in other areas. I mean, spoiler alert, he wasn't, but just so you don't have to take our word for it, let's move on to look at his views on modern art. Let's look at this quote of Hitler's regarding the Degenerate Art Exhibition, a 1937 exhibition held in Munich that showcased 650 examples of abstract and interpretive art. Quoting, "Works of art which cannot be understood in themselves but need some pretentious instruction book to justify their existence will never again find their way to the German people." But it wasn't just the pretentiousness of modern art of which Hitler objected to. He also saw such art as promoting damaging values, as explained by the following statement, which he stated at a 1935 party rally, quoting again, "It is not the mission of art to wallow in filth for filth's sake, to paint the human being only in a state of putrefaction, to draw cretins as symbols of motherhood, or to present deformed idiots as representatives of manly strength." So then, while we've only penetrated the surface here, and indeed we could spend this whole video discussing this matter if we wanted to get carried away, we have seen enough to be able to say that scholarly definition of Nazism as a far-right ideology certainly seems to be correct, or well-founded at the very least. So now, for a contrary perspective that'll get our noggins a-jogging, let's move on and have a look at where the Nazis placed themselves on the left versus right political spectrum. And straight away, things start to get tricky, because the Nazis saw their ideas as being a combination that took elements from both the left and the right, but not in a way that made them centrist per se. Instead, they saw their unique combination of ideas as being completely separate and ultimately above such traditional, supposedly kettling and restrictive definitions. Such a view isn't just unique to just Nazism either, as it was a fundamental tenet and defining characteristic of most fascist and neo-fascist ideologies. So prevalent was it, in fact, that scholars such as Roger Griffin in his 1991 work The Nature of Fascism and Anthony Gregor in his 2008 work Marxism, Fascism and Totalitarianism, chapters in the intellectual history of radicalism, would coin a specific term to describe it: third position politics, with the term coming from the self-described stances of post-war neo-fascist movements such as the Third Way from France and the Third Position from Italy. As for Nazism in particular, neither Hitler nor any other leading Nazi ever made an outright statement to the effect of "we are third positioners," but they did clearly explain their ideology as an egocentric combination and rejection of the left versus right paradigm in a way that was in keeping with it, as demonstrated by this declaration of Hitler's from 1921, quoting again, "The National Socialist movement will in the future ruthlessly prevent, if necessary by force, all activities of the Marxists or of the reactionary monarchists. Only in this way will we create a solid bulwark against the forces of international destruction of national states." And look, you don't get much clearer cut third position than rejecting both Marxists and monarchists while dressing it up with a big dollop of nationalism. But what of the more specific tenets of the third position politics? How does Nazism line up with them? Well, let's begin to answer that by looking at both anti-Marxism and anti-capitalism. Now, obviously, we have already seen anti-Marxist ideas in our previous quote, but just to really drive home the point, here's another one from Mein Kampf this time. It was during this period that my eyes were opened to two perils, the names of which I scarcely knew hitherto, and had no notion whatsoever of their terrible significance for the existence of the German people. These two perils were Marxism and Judaism. As for anti-capitalism, Hitler said the following in a speech given in 1935, quoting, "I do not even want to mention the capitalist states. They do not take care of their unemployed, because no American millionaire will ever come into the area where they live, and no unemployed man will ever go to the area where the millionaires live. While hunger marches to Washington and to the White House are organized, they are usually dispersed en route by the police by means of rubber truncheons and tear gas. Such things do not exist in authoritarian Germany." Not only was he clearly stating that his Germany was not a capitalist state here, but also he didn't exactly have nice things to say about capitalism either, demonstrating both that he did not consider himself a capitalist and neither did he endorse capitalism. Beyond that, another key third position stance is that of having a state that strongly intervenes in the economy, but in a way that retains personal property rights. Nazism's adherence to such a stance is demonstrated with the following extract, which Hitler proclaimed shortly after his ascension to the chancellorship in 1933. "I want everyone to keep the property that he has acquired for himself according to the principle, benefit to the community precedes benefit to the individual. But the state should retain supervision, and each property owner should consider himself appointed by the state. It is his duty not to use his property against the interests of others among his own people. This is the crucial matter. The Third Reich will always retain its right to control the owners of property." Then there is ultranationalism and racial ideology, elements of third position politics that tragically require no introduction. On ultranationalism, Hitler wrote the following in Mein Kampf. "The spirit of nationalism and a feeling for social justice must be fused into one sentiment in the hearts of the youth. Then a day will come when a nation of citizens will arise which will be welded together through a common love and a common pride that shall be invincible and indestructible forever." As for Hitler having a racial ideology, evidence doesn't come much clearer cut than in the following extract, also from Mein Kampf. "We all feel that in the distant future, many may be faced with problems which can be solved only by a superior race of human beings, a race destined to become master of all the other peoples, and which will have at its disposal the means and resources of the whole world." As for the specifics of the race Hitler believed to be superior, we shall get to that in later chapters when we dive deeper into the specifics of Nazi racialism. But for now, let's keep things on track and continue with this foundational outlining of Nazi third positionism by discussing the ideologies populism. Nazis often portrayed themselves as a movement of the common people, against elites, both traditional elites, as was the case with the aristocrats, and the elites that they made up, as was the case with the Jews. Neither Hitler nor any other leading Nazi came outright and said, "We are populists," but they alluded to it very strongly, as demonstrated by the following extract from Mein Kampf. "Read with attention the speeches which our parliamentarians make during one session alone on political problems and on questions of foreign policy in particular. Remember that those gentlemen are, or claim to be, the elite of the German nation, and that at least a great number of them have sat on the benches of our secondary schools, and that many of them have passed through our universities." It's here that we quite clearly see Hitler laying out a group who he believes to be the elites, elected politicians in this specific instance, and then making it clear that he considered himself and his followers separate from them. And to really drive the populist point home, as Hitler went on to continue speaking after that extract, he would not just establish who he believed the elites were, but also how he believed them to be negative actors, quoting again, "Then you will realize how defective the historical education of these people has been. If these gentlemen had never studied history at all, but had possessed a sound instinct for public affairs, things would have gotten better, and the nation would have benefited greatly thereby." Finally, the defining characteristics of third position politics are militarism and expansionism, both of which Hitler and other leading Nazis were big proponents of. To demonstrate this, Hitler wrote the following on expansionism in Mein Kampf, quoting again, "It was possible to think of acquiring new territory on which a certain portion of the increasing population could be settled each year. The principle of acquiring new territory on which the surplus population could be settled has many advantages to recommend it. Such a territorial policy, however, cannot find its fulfillment in the Cameroons, but almost exclusively here in Europe. In considering this state of affairs today, one must not allow existing political frontiers to distract attention from what ought to exist on principles of strict justice. If this earth has sufficient room for all, then we ought to have that share of the soil which is absolutely necessary for our existence. As for militarism, the Nazi position can be surmised by the following extract from a speech Hitler made in 1945, quoting, "God the Almighty has made our nation. By defending its existence, we are defending his work. Therefore, it is all the more necessary on this 12th anniversary of the rise to power to strengthen the heart more than ever before and to steel ourselves in the holy determination to wield the sword no matter where and under what circumstances until final victory crowns our efforts." As for his willingness to use that military, that is best summarized by the following extract from his declaration of war on the US in 1941, quote, "Today I am at the head of the strongest army in the world, the most gigantic air force, and of a proud navy. Behind and around me stands the party with which I became great, and which has become great through me. Our enemies must not deceive themselves. In the 2,000 years of German history known to us, our people have never been more united than today." Consequently then, following this review of third position politics, we can see how, by their own admission, the Nazis lined up with it despite it being a retroactive scholarly term. So then, which is correct? Is Nazism a far-right ideology, as the bulk of scholars say, or is it, as the Nazis themselves said and other scholars say, a third position ideology? Now, ultimately, there's no right or wrong answer here. Scholars have spent years debating this very matter, and we're not going to be so bold as to assume that we, of all people, have reached the objective truth on the matter in today's episode. But it is important that you yourself come down on one of these two sides, as it will be a lens through which you build your broader understanding of Nazism. So, what do you think? I mean, take a few minutes, think it over, and render your verdict. And while you're thinking, allow us to just clarify something. We had intended to also present the perspective of Nazism as a potential left-wing ideology. That way we could have considered the full spectrum of left, kinda center, and right. The problem was we found basically nothing scholarly that made the case that Nazism was left-wing, with the only real advocates of this position being the very partisan political actors that we are trying to move away from through this in-depth discussion. No stress at all if you believe that yourself, of course. As we say, there are no right or wrong answers ultimately. We just personally wouldn't be happy making that case on the basis of the research that we've done. So with that said, hopefully you now have all had time to render your verdict on this chapter's big question. So now let's move on to pick apart some choice aspects of Nazi ideology in depth and, well, what do you know it? We just happen to have already discussed the basics in this chapter. How handy, it's almost like we did that intentionally so that we could settle a key controversy and give you a base familiarity all in one fell swoop. Clever, isn't it? So let's begin our deep dive by looking at the Nazi idea, the one that would earn it its place in infamy as one of the evilest to ever curse mankind. Their racialism. Racialism being a belief that race determines human traits and capacities. And there can be no better place to start than with the term Aryan. This is likely one that you've heard before, as after all, it has rather penetrated the cultural zeitgeist since the Nazis started using it, and likely you have an idea in your head that an Aryan in the Nazi context is a blonde-haired, blue-eyed German, supposed Superman that ticks all of the boxes on Hitler's genetic shopping list. That idea, however, is false, or at least it's a gross oversimplification of actual Nazi ideas. Not that we disparage or think less of anyone for believing this falsehood, we should make clear, because it is one with perfectly understandable and innocent enough roots. Specifically, it comes from the classroom, because the world over, teachers find themselves with the most unenviable task of having to promptly and concisely explain Nazi racial theory to classrooms full of teenagers who, on account of their age, typically lack both the attention span and developed enough thinking to be able to grasp the full complexities of Nazi racialism. They therefore, rather understandably, get fed a simplified and streamlined version of the reality, and with their reading of history typically ending upon their graduation, this simplified narrative thus spreads its roots and becomes a dominant narrative. So with that said, let's get into the reality of the matter, shall we? Nazi racialism began in the minds of leading Nazis, such as Anton Drexler, the founder and chairman of the German Workers' Party, or DAP, an earlier incarnation of the Nazi Party. Also involved was Alfred Rosenberg, one of the earliest members of the DAP, and of course Adolf Hitler himself. Right from the offset, racialism was a fundamental aspect of the DAP's beliefs, but for many, it was more of a passive belief that they held almost by default and without any proactive thought. They were early 20th century nationalists. I mean, of course they were racialists. It was only when one of the aforementioned men, one who was really keen on it, took the time to flesh out that vague, lingering racialism into a more considered set of beliefs that it really took hold in the party as a core and fundamental tenet. The man in question wasn't the one you'd imagine either, as it was actually Rosenberg, not Hitler, who did the legwork on the matter. To put it simply, Rosenberg believed that the races of the world existed in a ranking system of sorts, one in which the Aryans, as he called them, sat firmly at the top. These Aryans weren't just Germans either, as you might initially imagine. Instead, Rosenberg believed that this racial group that he had made up actually encompassed a wider range of peoples, specifically Germans, Scandinavians, the Flemish, and the Dutch. Further to this, and somewhat confusingly, he also included the Anglo-Saxon stock from across the Anglosphere in his hierarchy, i.e. white Britons and their colonial descendants overseas. All the other races beyond that were, in Rosenberg's view, either so-called Untermensch, which translates literally as underman, and more accurately as subhuman, or Mischling, which translates roughly as mixed race. The degree of hatred he reserved for them varied greatly and was influenced by their near-Aryan nature, how close he perceived them to being true Aryans genetically, and geopolitics, because rather conveniently, Rosenberg always found a way to blag that the people of nations Germany was buttering up politically just happened to be high quality, a pragmatic hypocrisy best summed up by an action he later took in 1940 while serving as the leader of the Foreign Policy Office, when he declared that the Japanese were Ehrenaria, which translates as honorary Aryans, just before Germany signed the tripartite pact with them and Italy. But when Rosenberg wasn't being geopolitically hypocritical, which races did Rosenberg believe were the lesser ones, and what were the implications of that belief on Nazi policy? Well, let's begin by answering that by starting with the obvious one, the Jews, the group that sat right at the bottom of Rosenberg's racial totem pole. In stark contrast to modern understanding, in which we know that Jews are a unified religious and by extension cultural group within which distinctive ethnic subgroups are formed thanks to the very long-lived history of the faith, but that these ethnic subgroups are little but quirks of historical circumstance that have very little if any bearing on the practice and execution of Judaism in the real world, Rosenberg believed that Judaism itself was a distinct racial group, one that was totally separate from, different to, and above all else, dangerous to the Aryan race. The exact genesis of this horrifically anti-Semitic perspective is hard to pin down, as Rosenberg was remarkably guarded with details of his earlier life, but it seems fair to reason that it had a dual-faced origin. The first being the general anti-Semitic sentiments that permeated basically all Western nationalist movements in the late 19th and early 20th century, and the second being the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a book that took the young Rosenberg's crude and general anti-Semitism and made it heartfelt, driven, and almost zealous in the strength of its conviction. In case you don't know, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion was first published in Imperial Russia in 1903 and explains a supposed Jewish plot to castrate and then take over the world with methods such as mass land acquisition, the infiltration and subversion of education, and the co-opting of international finance. It was a work of complete conspiratorial fiction, the early 20th century equivalent of a lengthily spelling error-ridden deranged 4chan post on Poll, and it was also largely plagiarized, made up of chopped-up extracts of earlier works intentionally edited to paint Jews in the worst possible light. The parts that weren't plagiarized were pulled right out of the author's rectum and had absolutely no grounding in fact or reality, not that we even know whose rectum the deranged scribblings were pulled out of, as it was published completely anonymously. The work was completely debunked even in Rosenberg's time, with a British newspaper, The Times, publishing a comprehensive debunking of it in 1921, followed shortly afterwards by a similar debunking in the German newspaper Frankfurter Zeitung in 1924. Rosenberg never got the message, however, or at least he chose to ignore the message because he would become absolutely obsessed with the global Jewish conspiracy that it perpetrated, which would in turn go on to be the foundation of his own anti-Semitic racialism going forward. This is evidenced by the regular and repeated referencing of it in his own work, with the most notable being Commentary on the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which he published in 1923, and lesser examples being The Jew as a World Parasite, which he published in 1943, and Anti-State Zionism, published in 1922. These works all had the same energy. Germany's woes were to blame on the international Jewish conspiracy laid out in the protocols, with slight differences in that the earlier ones blamed them for losing World War I, and the latter ones blamed them for the impending loss of World War II. As for the Slavs, one of the other most targeted groups that Rosenberg decried as Untermensch, the origin of his sentiments are less clear than his views on the Jews, but we do know that he considered them a fundamentally uncivilized and uncivilizable people, as demonstrated by this quote from his magnum opus, the the Myth of the 20th Century, which was published in 1930, quoting, "The Nordic race once existed in Eastern Europe, but here again it was intermixed with a variety of other races including Magyars, Slavs, Mongols, Jews, and so on. If the Germans had survived in our time as overlords without mixing, then this area might have continued to have civilization as it had earlier in world history." Interestingly, when it comes to the Slavs, this is about as extreme as it gets from Rosenberg, and in comparison to his absolute cellular level hatred of the Jews, he was actually quite moderate on the matter, at least by Nazi standards. Rather than total extermination, he called for the de facto enslavement of Slavic peoples under various German-controlled buffer-cum-vassal states in the East. He even went so far as to publicly criticize their slaughter by his associates. Not that this criticism came from a humanitarian angle, you must understand. Oh no, he simply saw their killing as a waste of resources that could be used to fuel the Nazi war machine. Instead, the real hatred for Slavs within Nazism would come from other Nazi thinkers, such as Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, and Reinhard Heydrich, the kind of boss of Nazi secret policing. As for homosexuals, another group that was targeted heavily by Nazism, the hatred Rosenberg directed towards them wasn't racial in and of itself, but it was linked very closely. To Rosenberg, homosexuality was a so-called degenerate behavior that had been let loose upon and subsequently blighted Germany once the Jews had wormed their way into commanding positions in society and started doing that meddling that he believed was so intrinsic to their character during and after World War I, and thus we cannot separate it from his views on race. To evidence that, Rosenberg believed homosexuality came from Judaism. We only have to look at the following extract from the Myth of the 20th Century, in which he wrote the following while discussing farmers, quoting, "He was the principal carrier of the folkish ideal, but he was being moved off his farm and into the city, lured by plutocratic economic promises. His values changed from rural spiritual to urban materialistic. Once that regression was completed, he would accept the whole of French Jewish decadence. He could accept red light districts and racial mixing and homosexuality and crime." Indeed, this supposed cosmopolitan aspect to homosexuality was something that Rosenberg was very insistent on, as later in the Myth of the 20th Century he went on to say the following when discussing Berlin, a city he believed to become a hotbed of Jewish degeneracy during the Weimar years, quoting, "It harbored those who elsewhere might have been subjected to ridicule or persecution. Comintern agents, Dadaist poets, expressionist painters, anarchist philosophers, sexologists, vegetarian and Esperantist prophets of a new humanity, freeloaders, courtesans, homosexuals, drug addicts, naked dancers, and professional criminals flourished in a city which was hungry for the new, the sensational, the extreme." Rosenberg's hatred of homosexuality was so intense, in fact, that it even tarnished his perception of classical civilizations, as evidenced by this quote again from the Myth of the 20th Century, in which he's discussing Etruscan civilization. In endlessly repeated obscenities, the original myth is degraded into repulsive homosexual love. This is to be seen on the wall paintings of graves, as in the Galeni tomb, where the dead man holds a banquet with his boy lover in the next world, and where two gigantic phalluses spring up from a sacrificial fire as a result of magical satanic rite. Having heard all of that about Rosenberg, who was the leading Nazi racial theorist, don't forget, already the Holocaust is no doubt starting to make a lot more sense to you. But while Rosenberg might be the most important Nazi racial thinker for us to understand today, he didn't have a monopoly on shaping Nazi racialism, far from it in fact. So now let's move on and have a look at some of the other thinkers that contributed, starting with Hans Gunther, a man whose contributions to the field would see him dubbed the Race Pope. His career in racial science began after World War I, when, after completing a PhD in comparative linguistics at Albert Ludwigs University in Freiburg, he began writing Völkisch nationalist works, Völkisch nationalism being a branch of German ethno-nationalism that began back in the late 19th century and was characterized by so-called blood and soil nationalism. Nationalism that combines racial purity, blood, with a deep connection to one's native land, soil, and emphasizes the importance of heritage and homelands for a nation's identity and survival. The first such work he published, The Night, Death, and the Devil, The Heroic Idea, in 1919, and this and subsequent works like it would see him heavily praised and lauded within academia, with him picking up numerous awards from the University of Uppsala and the Swedish Institute for Race Biology. And yes, you didn't mishear us, race biology was a thing back in the day. Such a career naturally put him right on the Nazis' radar, and when he became a professor of race science, human biology, and rural ethnography at Berlin University in 1935, a meeting with Hitler and other leading members members of the Nazi government soon followed. So they all hit it off a treat, and from then on, Gunther would become not just an inspiration for the Nazi regime, but one of its go-to race gurus. One of his greatest contributions was cementing the Nazi definition of race, which they took from his 1927 work, The Racial Elements of European History, and defined as, quoting here, something that shows itself in a human group which is marked off from every other human group through its own proper combination of bodily and mental characteristics, and in turn produces only its like. He also drew a distinction between race and Volk, two terms that many Nazis used interchangeably, but actually had different meanings. He defined race as we just saw, but for Volk, which translates directly as people, he defined that as a German racial, ethnic, or national identity, or any combination thereof, bound together through inherited genetic kinship. Now that reads slightly as word soup to our modern ears, so don't overthink it. Just remember Volk as an equivalent term to the superior German peoples, and you've more or less got the idea. As for the Jews, according to Gunther, they were a Mongoloid race, his words, not ours, we must stress, who had become so tainted by inbreeding that they had become a unique race all of their own, with him describing this mix as including Near Eastern, East Asian, East Baltic, Inner Asian, Nordic, Hamite, and African. The lot of them, basically. Although not quite as profound as that of Rosenberg, Gunther's ideas had a vast influence on both leading Nazis and the public. On the latter point, the Nazi racial curriculum at the primary and secondary education levels was taken directly from his work, albeit simplified and boiled down into an easily digestible and highly propagandized format, and at the higher education level, his work became mandatory reading, not just for students of racial science, but for all German students, as minors in racial science were bolted onto basically every university course in the Reich. As for his influence on leading Nazis, he was close friends with most of the senior Nazi leadership, and barely a week wouldn't go by in which he wasn't hosted for dinner and have full command of an important pair of ears while he ate. All except Goering anyways, as Gunther found both his open and flagrant corruption and a barely concealed opiate dependence as being thoroughly deplorable. Hitler himself kept 6 of Gunther's works in his personal library, a modest collection reserved only for his most cherished and leafed-through tomes. Then there was Richard Walther Dare. Born in 1895 in Argentina to a family of German descent, his life journey took him back to Germany, where he pursued a career in agriculture and agricultural technology, earning an undergraduate degree from King's College in London in 1911, and eventually a PhD from the University of Halle in 1929, missing some years in the middle to fight in World War I. His early work was quite proper and above board, with most of his publications being on the technical aspects of agriculture. So how did someone so seemingly benign become one of the bigwigs of Nazi racialism? Well, that would be through his interest in blood and soil nationalism, just like Gunther. His interest in it went deep, much deeper than Gunther's, if you can believe it, and through work such as Peasantry and The Life Source of the Nordic Race, published in 1928, and A New Nobility of Blood and Soil, published in 1930, he would end up completely reworking traditional blood and soil nationalism for the Nazi worldview, creating agreed-upon definitions which the whole Nazi machine, from the very bottom to the very top, would then use going forward. At the heart of his vision was the belief in a profound racial and agrarian connection. He posited that the German peasantry, working closely with the soil, represented not just an economic backbone, but also a racial ideal. For Dare, these farmers were the purest embodiment of the Aryan race, untainted by the corrupting influences of cosmopolitanism and modernity. This view fostered deep-seated anti-urban sentiment within Nazi ideology, where city life was depicted as a hotbed of moral and racial decay, a belief we have already seen reflected in other Nazi thinkers. The countryside, in contrast, was idealized as a bastion of racial purity and traditional German values. With that in mind, he wanted to preserve small, hereditary farms across Germany, which he saw as vital to maintaining the racial health of the nation. The Nazi bigwigs liked these ideas, and so Dare found himself appointed Reich Minister for Food and Agriculture when the party came to power, and we shall have a look at some of his policies there later. Now, the final Nazi racial theorist that you should be aware of is Ernst Rudin. Born in Switzerland in 1874, he was a psychiatrist by trade, having studied his way across universities in Switzerland, Germany, Italy, and Ireland before finally finishing a PhD in psychology at the University of Berlin in 1899. He then took up a teaching position at the University of Munich, where he found himself ever more drawn toward exploring studying mental illnesses. Much of his early work was legitimately good stuff, such as being one of the earliest voices to advocate for exploring the genetic passing of mental conditions, but unfortunately the worldviews he then formed off the back of that groundbreaking research were, well, of great interest to the Nazis, let's say it like that, and he soon found himself fully embracing eugenics, eventually becoming the co-editor-in-chief of the Archive for Racial Hygiene and Social Biology in 1904, and co-founding the German Society for Racial Hygiene in 1905. From there, his career and prestige only went from strength to strength, and when the Nazis came to power in 1933, he was asked to join the newly formed Expert Committee on Questions of Population and Racial Policy under Reich Interior Minister Wilhelm Frick, becoming its founding member. He took to this so well that he soon found himself endearingly referred to as the Reichsführer for sterilization. He remained on the committee until the fall of the Nazi Empire in 1945, and for that entire time, he sat as a devil on the shoulder of senior Nazi leadership, whispering his eugenicist wisdom into their ears. Okay, so now we know about the key leading Nazi racialist thinkers. It's important that we learn how they shaped Nazi policy. Crucially, you should note that while Nazi racialists shared core beliefs, as we have outlined in this chapter, the ideology had no defining corpus. At no point did the party ever make an effort to, through either lectures or literature, make a concerted effort to say, this is our line on X, or that is our line on Y. Instead, Nazi racialism was an organic and fluid belief system, constantly being altered, shaped, and interpreted in ever so slightly different ways by its many adherents, be they the Alfred Rosenbergs and Ernst Rudens of the world, who had enormous individual sway and could influence the beliefs of thousands with their words, or low-level bureaucrats and party members whose words had command over maybe a workplace or a dinner party, respectively. So, with that said, let's now bring everything we've learned in this chapter together and see how Nazi racial theory looked in the real world, i.e., when it got turned into policy, starting with something that you've likely already heard of, the Nuremberg Laws, a set of racist laws that were enacted on the 15th of September 1935, consisting of the Law for the Protection of German Blood and German Honor and the Reich Citizenship Law. Both of these laws were quite short and to the point as far as legislation goes, so rather than having us compress and recite the laws to your second hand, let's have a look at them in full so that you can fully appreciate their dark content, starting with the Law for the Protection of German Blood and German Honor, quoting here, "Moved by the understanding that purity of German blood is the essential condition for the continued existence of the German people, and inspired by the inflexible determination to ensure the existence of the German nation for all time, the Reichstag has unanimously adopted the following law, which is promulgated herewith. Article 1. Marriages between Jews and citizens of German or related blood are forbidden. Marriages nevertheless concluded are invalid, even if concluded abroad to circumvent this law. Annulment proceedings can be initiated only by the state prosecutor. Article 2. Extramarital relations between Jews and citizens of German or related blood are forbidden. Article 3. Jews may not employ in their households female subjects of the state of Germany or related blood who are under 45 years old. Article 4. Jews are forbidden to fly the Reich or national flag or display Reich colors. They are, on the other hand, permitted to display the Jewish colors. The exercise of this right is protected by the state. Article 5. Any person who violates the prohibition under Article 1 will be punished with a prison sentence with hard labor. A male who violates the prohibition under Article 2 will be punished with a jail term or prison sentence with hard labor. Any person violating the provisions under Article 3 or 4 will be punished with a jail term of up to 1 year or with one of the other of these penalties. Article 6. The Reich Minister of the Interior, in cooperation with the Deputy of the Führer and Reich Minister of Justice, will issue the legal and administrative regulations required to implement and complete this law. Article 7. A law takes effect on the day following promulgation, except for Article 3, which goes into force on January 1st, 1936. The quote ends, and now let's have a look at the Reich Citizenship Law, quoting again. The Reichstag has unanimously enacted the following law, which is promulgated herewith. Article 1. A subject of the state who is a person who enjoys the protection of the German Reich and who, in consequence, has specific obligations toward it. The status of subject of the state is acquired in accordance with the provisions of the Reich and the Reich Citizenship Law. Article 2. A Reich citizen is a subject of the state who is of German or related blood and proves by his conduct that he is willing and fit to faithfully serve the German people and Reich. Reich citizenship is acquired through the granting of a Reich citizenship certificate. The Reich citizen is the sole bearer of full political rights in accordance with the law. Article 3. The Reich Minister of the Interior, in coordination with the Deputy of the Führer, will issue the legal and administrative orders required to implement and complete this law. The quote ends. Now, the influence of the racial thinkers that we talked about earlier is quite clear in these laws. For example, the law for the protection of German blood and German honor is clearly reminiscent of Rosenberg and Gunther. For Rosenberg, it is his emphasis on a racial hierarchy with Aryans at the top and the Untermensch beneath them that is reflected in the law's marriage limitations, and its establishing of both the Aryans as a privileged class in German society and the Untermensch as a proactively persecuted lesser people in German society. Similarly, we're also seeing Gunther's racial classifications being codified, the race he so fiercely decried as being Mongoloid and of tainted breeding being the one that the law for the protection of German blood and German honor takes aim at. As for Rudin, well, the racial hygiene-obsessed anti-Semite couldn't have penned a law more to his liking. Who we don't see reflected in the Nuremberg laws is Dare. Sure, he bought into the basic racialism of Nazism, but it was hardly his main focus. It was the specific blood and soil lens of racialism that was his intellectual pride and joy. So, to see his influence in actualized Nazi racialism, we must come away from the Nuremberg laws and instead look at the hereditary farm law. Implemented on September 29, 1933, the primary objective of the law was to preserve small, family-owned farms. These were the ones that Nazis considered the backbone of the German nation and a crucial element in maintaining the purity and health of the Aryan race. The law sought to prevent these farms from becoming fragmented through inheritance practices and aimed to keep them within families for generations. It did this by creating hereditary farm as a legal term, defining it as a farm that was neither too small to sustain a family nor too large to be worked by a single family without extensive use of hired labor, and gave a ballpark numerical approximation of this size as being 309 acres. Having defined this, the law then went on to stipulate that such farms could not be sold, divided, or mortgaged. Instead, their ownership could only change by being passed down unmolested to a single heir. Furthermore, it also decreed that such farms would receive rather generous government subsidies. But don't be fooled by these subsidies into thinking this was an economic move reminiscent of Soviet agricultural collectivism. No, this law was all about the blood and soil, and it's quite easy to see how. By locking farms into family ownership, it would ensure that the supposed unique Aryan characteristics of the agrarian class would be preserved as land acquisition within the countryside became all but impossible, and thus made the movement of people into the countryside for all except salaried labor effectively impossible. The subsidies also gave rural Germans a reason to dismiss the alluring temptations of city life, thus depriving them of the impetus to leave and ensuring that the demographic characteristics of the countryside were preserved. And if you still aren't convinced that this law had Dare's prints all over it, well, it quite literally did. Remember when we said he was made the Reich Minister for Food and Agriculture? Well, yeah, he wrote the law, didn't he? But what of Rosenberg's vitriolic hate of homosexuals? Where do we see that reflected in Nazi policy? A particular pertinent answer to that is paragraph 175 of the German Penal Code. This code, which penalized homosexual acts between men, was not a Nazi creation and actually goes all the way back to the Prussian Penal Code prior to unification in 1871, but it was majorly expanded by the Nazis in 1935. Prior to that, Germany had actually been one of the better countries in Europe when it came to the treatment of homosexuals. Not perfect, of course, but certainly better than, say, the United Kingdom, where homosexuals could easily find themselves castrated or beaten to death in the street. Germany was so much better than its neighbors, in fact, that come 1929, following a huge wave of liberalism during the Weimar era, the coalition of the Social Democrats, the Communist Party, and the German Democratic Party even won a vote to repeal paragraph 175 and legalize gay marriage, which would have made it the first country in Europe to do so by a lead of 70 years. Unfortunately, however, because of the chaos of the early 30s, the vote was never ratified, and thus paragraph 175 remained on the books when the Nazis came to power. As for what happens to homosexuals under paragraph 175's hardened Nazi form, when identified they were arrested, with 100,000 being arrested and 50,000 charged in Germany alone between 1933 and 1945, and countless more in the occupied territories. Of those convicted, most were eventually transported to concentration camps where they were then worked to death per concentration camp norms, with many of them also being subjected to various procedures to cure their homosexuality while they were interned, the most common of which was castration, both physical and chemical. Note, however, paragraph 175 was applied selectively, with homosexual party members, especially senior ones, typically being overlooked. Note that it still did discuss the other Nazis, however. They just looked the other way because it was politically expedient. It was, particularly within the SA, a surprising amount of which its senior leadership was homosexual, with notable examples being Ernst Röhm, the leader of the organization, and Edmund Heinz, his right-hand man. Note further, if you would, when the SA leadership was purged in 1934 in the Night of the Long Knives, this was not influenced by many of their homosexual orientations and was instead done because the militant nature of the group was sparking semi-justified concerns about them mounting a counter-revolution against Hitler, at least by current scholarly consensus. The anti-homosexual justification that is often touted was the creation of Goebbels' retroactive propaganda on the matter to avoid having to publicly admit that Hitler felt his position threatened by Rom, although certainly, given that homosexuality discussed in the wider party, they weren't complaining about seeing them killed. And while we're on the matter of homosexuality, it's worth noting that Rosenberg was far from the only senior party member with a particularly vitriolic hatred of them. We just couldn't mention them earlier, as it would have disrupted our focus on Rosenberg as the key thinker pushing Nazi racialist thinking. Particularly of note is Heinrich Himmler, a man so homophobic that he gave a speech on the matter in 1937 titled The Homosexual Threat to Civilization, in which, just to give you an idea of what he was talking about, he said the following, to quote, "I would like to develop a couple of ideas for you on the question of homosexuality. There are these homosexuals who take the view, what I do is my business, a purely private matter. However, all things which take place in the sexual sphere are not the private affair of the individual, but signify the life and death of the nation. The people which has many children has the candidature for world power and world domination. A people of good race which has too few children has a one-way ticket to the grave. Therefore, we must be absolutely clear that if we continue to have this burden in Germany without being able to fight it, then that is the end of Germany and the end of the Germanic world. Unfortunately, we don't have it as easy as our forefathers. The homosexual was drowned in a swamp. The professional gentlemen who find these corpses in peat bogs are certainly unaware that in 90 out of 100 cases, they have a homosexual before them who was drowned in a swamp, clothes and all. That wasn't a punishment, but simply the extinguishment of abnormal life. It had to be got rid of, just as we pull out weeds, throw them on a heap, and burn them. They will be sent, by my order, to a concentration camp, and they will be shot." The quote ends. Note how, for Himmler too, just like Rosenberg, sexuality and race were intertwined things, once again justifying its conclusion in this chapter. For him, homosexuality meant less children, and less children meant less soldiers and workers, which in Himmler's view would result in the weakening and eventual destruction of the Aryan race. So, after all that then, we now have quite a comprehensive understanding of Nazi racialism. We know the key people who shaped it as an idea and their specific interpretations, and we know how those ideas then turned into policy once the Nazis came to power in 1933. Above all else, however, we have learned one key thing that we would like you all to retain. Nazi racialism wasn't a unified belief system, but instead an organic and fluid set of principles unified by no central codex, just the vaguely complementary pillars of Aryans good, Mischling and Untermensch bad, which within a whole spread of sub-ideas fought for dominance. This understanding of Nazi racialism will also prove valuable once we bring this chapter to a close, because while we may be moving to look at other aspects of Nazism, it will come as no surprise to you all to find out that everything in Nazism was viewed through this lens, even something as outwardly innocuous as economics, which is exactly what we're going to move on to right now. Much like the Nazis' third position politics, that were, to some extent at least, a blend of both left and right-wing positions smashed together to create something new, their economic philosophy followed a similar hybrid trajectory, being a third-way economic model, i.e. a mixed economy which is neither planned nor free market, but has aspects of both to it, or as they put it, because of course everything had to be racialized in Nazism, a rejection of both American plutocracy and Jewish Bolshevism. This, in and of itself, doesn't particularly tell us much, given the fact that third-way economics is an unfathomably large umbrella term which encompasses countless different theories and ideas concerning how planned an economy should be and how free an economy should be. To demonstrate this point, nowadays basically every country on Earth operates a third-way mixed economy to one degree or another. Even a country that leans heavily on the planned side, such as North Korea, utilizes market forces to a limited degree in its state planning following recent reforms by Kim Jong-un, and a country that leans heavily on the free market side, such as Singapore, still has a basic level of government dictation in its economy to maintain basic safety standards in things such as construction, healthcare, and the environment. So then, to understand what the Nazi interpretation of third-way economics looked like, a deep dive is in order, isn't it? We should begin by having a look at the absolutely catastrophic economy of Weimar Germany, the lived experience of which, above all else, shaped Nazi economics. The first Weimar economic disaster of note is the 1923 hyperinflation crisis. To put it simply, this crisis was caused by a combination of the unfathomably large reparation payments forced upon Germany following World War I and the Weimar government's woefully inept response thereto. As to explain. Adjusted for inflation, Germany owed about $500 million, an amount so unfathomably large that it simply could not ever hope to pay it back. But the Weimar government, being as smooth-brained as it was on matters of economics, thought it had found a nice little workaround. The reparation amount was a specific fixed sum, 132 billion gold marks to give a ballpark figure. So, well, what if they just printed more cash to pay it off? This did at least achieve the desired goal of paying off the reparations. It just also absolutely crashed the value of the mark thanks to massively increasing the supply of currency in circulation. As a result of this, prices went through the roof. The price of a loaf of bread going from 250 marks in January 1923 to 200 billion marks come November of that same year. Factories laid off workers en masse as all demand for their goods dried up. With unemployment now rampant and the value of what currency people did have saved suddenly being near nil, crime went through the roof as people started turning to desperate measures to survive. Prostitution also exploded, with people of all classes, all genders, and even children turning to the trade to aid their survival. That last detail, the one about children, really stuck with the Nazis, and right the way through their rise to power, they would come back to it time and time again to justify their want to racially transform the German economy. But 1923 was nothing. All that did was mold the Nazis' economic ideas, and it would be the Wall Street crash of 1929 and the most apocalyptic Great Depression that followed that would chuck these nascent ideas into a kiln and bake them until they were cast solid and made immovable. Prior to the crash, the German economy had just about been duct taped back together through the taking out of many, many foreign loans, mostly from the US, and life, more or less, returned to normal in Germany, or was at least tolerable and survivable. But then, following the crash, American financial institutions, desperate to get their hands on any cash they could muster, called in loans across Germany, and suddenly everyone from small-scale businessmen through to the government itself suddenly found themselves owing serious amounts of money that they simply didn't have. And so, in an instant, government welfare spending all but ceased, and businesses across Germany shuttered. As a result of this, poverty rates rocketed up through the stratosphere, and millions were left unemployed in a matter of months. From there, things only got worse. The value of the mark collapsed once again and wiped out savings, and tragically, mass begging and prostitution filled the streets of Germany yet again. This time, however, there'd be no quick fix, and the miserable situation not only continued, but grew in scope. Germany then fell into localized and undeclared proto-civil wars as the people began turning to extremist parties in search of an answer, and empowered by this, the militant wings of these parties, such as the Nazis' SA and the German Communist Party's Antifaschistische Aktion, began fighting it out in the streets, fighting that would claim thousands of lives on all sides by 1933. Following this, Nazi economic principles were set in concrete. So now let's learn what those principles and their consequential policy was. Note first, they were a group effort with many different thinkers contributing to them, but one man, above all others, stands paramount as the lead contributor, and that would be Gottfried Fieder. He was one of the party's first 100 members, and until his death in 1941, he'd be its lead economic theorist and a personal financial mentor to Hitler. It was also he who crafted the economic elements of the 25-point National Socialist program in 1920, the party's first ever manifesto, and as the years went on, he would write a library's worth of papers and theses outlining the development of Nazi economic theory. Sadly, we lack the time today to go into his works and the evolution of his ideas in any great depth. That's really the stuff of university lectures. So instead, let's focus on the end result, the policies themselves, as that is the far more pertinent thing for us to be focusing on, starting with trade policy. Central to Nazi trade policy was the concept of autarky, the idea that economy should be entirely self-sustaining and capable of producing everything it needs internally, thus rendering it impervious to the whims of foreign powers. Autarky is not something unique to the Nazis, and many political movements have advocated for it over the years, but the Nazi interpretation of the concept and how they would see it implemented, well, that was unique. To them, it was a lesson learned from World War I, where Allied naval blockades completely cut Germany off from both its colonies and its international trade partners. This hampered the war effort and inflicted unimaginable suffering on the populace, particularly later in the war. To achieve autarky, the Nazis implemented high tariffs and stringent legal limitations on imported goods. Both of these things would limit the amount of foreign goods that came into Germany, either by flatly blocking their import or by making them so expensive that all but the most well-heeled of German consumers wouldn't be able to afford them. The demands for the products would still be there, however, and so German industrialists, in their ever-ongoing pursuit of profits, would be more than happy to expand their operation and compete to get their share of this newly expanded market, and thus domestic production would be promoted. Some goods, however, simply couldn't be made domestically as things stood in 1933, as Germany lacked the raw materials needed to produce them. So, well, what did the Nazis do about that? Their chief response to that potentially geopolitically and military disastrous question was through the manufacturing and promotion of so-called ersatz, or substitute product, using materials that Germany did have. This was actually nothing new, as Germany had turned to such products when Allied blockades began to cut the country off during World War I, but the way in which they were implemented was really rather different. In World War I, there'd generally been ad hoc, spur-of-the-moment blags, things cooked up in the moment as and when Germany found itself lacking, and as a result they tended to be crude and questionably effective imitations of the real thing. In contrast to that approach, Nazi Germany would start tackling the matter of ersatz products in peacetime, when it had all the time in the world to get it done right, or at least to try and do that. Many of these products did fail. Some of these were substitutes for simple consumer goods: ersatz coffee made from various ingredients like roasted acorns, barley, chicory root, rye, and even beets, and ersatz tobacco made from a mix of leaves from other plants, sometimes even including tree leaves. Note, however, that many ersatz goods tended to be hated by the German consumer, particularly our prior examples of coffee and tobacco, as they simply weren't that good. Indeed, the former lacked any kind of caffeine-y goodness, and the latter lacked any kind of nicotine that would give the user an enjoyable rush. For this reason, and because Nazis loved a good bit of ideological hypocrisy when it suited their machinations, foreign consumer goods still flowed into Germany right until the end of the Reich, either officially as various tariffs were defanged or wiped altogether as and when it suited, or through the establishment of vast black market trade routes through neutral countries such as Sweden or Switzerland, with the party being more than willing to look the other way if it helped keep their subjects sweet. And a fun side note here, the much-loved zesty beverage Fanta actually started off as a Nazi ersatz product, being formulated in 1940 from sugar beet, whey, and apple pomace after US embargo saw Germany cut off from supplies of Coca-Cola syrup. Not once to let such petty things as human rights abuses get in the way of a good profit, Coca-Cola, still more than happy to profit from the German market, simply ordered its German subsidiary to cobble any old shit together from whatever they had lying around and carry on. Then, when the US joined the war, Coca-Cola ordered them to carry on and simply told them that they would collect the cash when the war was over. And don't forget too, Germany's Coca-Cola factories were also more than happy to make use of slave labor. As for the much more important industrial goods, the one that would bring the whole Nazi machine to a halt if they weren't done right, no effort or expense was spared in finding alternate ways to produce them internally. I mean, you could tell someone that they can smoke this crushed up tree instead of tobacco, but a Panzer IV is not going to be coaxed into action by sticking some yellow-colored dye in whatever liquid you had on hand and calling it fuel. They needed the real stuff. No ifs, no buts. As a result of this, the Nazi state invested heavily in coal liquefaction, the process of turning coal, which Germany had an insane amount of, into liquid fuel, which they had basically none of. Fortunately for the Nazis, while they had been causing havoc in the streets during the 1920s, German scientists had been, by pure coincidence, hard at work perfecting this technology, with Friedrich Bergius, Franz Fischer, and Hans Tropsch all having developed separate processes for liquefying coal. All the Nazis had to do was throw truckloads of taxpayers' cash at their ideas, build some big f***off plants, and the job was a good one. This saw the construction of a dozen liquefaction plants between 1936 and 1943, which at their height produced a collective total of over 4 million tons of synthetic oil each year. But much like the effort to achieve autarky in consumer goods, the efforts in industrial goods ultimately were a failure, as Germany never would be able to achieve self-reliance. Even despite the huge effort in domestic gasification, the German war machine would be totally dependent on Romanian oil. We don't have exact figures for the entirety of the Nazi period, but we do know that in 1941, Romania was providing Germany with up to 15,000 barrels of oil a day. That's give or take about a third of the entire amount it consumed. And that segues us nicely into the militarized and aggressive aspect of the Nazis' trade policy, because what does an openly expansionist ideology do when it can't get the goodies it needs indigenously? Well, it simply takes them, doesn't it? And this didn't always mean invading and taking the resources by force. Sometimes it meant securing and subsequently controlling allied nations in order to exploit their resources, with a great example of this being Romania, which was specifically courted and later manipulated to gain access to those vast oil reserves that we just discussed. The enormous quantities of troops the nation committed to German offenses throughout World War II, more than any other Axis nation combined, in fact, was just a cherry on the cake, because it was all about the oil. As for how the Nazis meddled in Romania's affairs to keep them on side, that included the backing of a pro-Nazi coup in 1940 under Ion Antonescu, as well as German money being offered to them either as aid payments or as very cheap loans, and supporting them in territorial disputes against Hungary and Bulgaria once they formally joined the Axis. All of this gave both the Romanian government and the Romanian population a genuine sense of goodwill toward the Nazis, as well as practical obligations to them that they couldn't afford to turn their back on, both literally and figuratively. For the resource-rich nations, it either couldn't or didn't want to court, however, it was military action that was used to secure the Nazis the precious resources they needed for autarky, with conquered nations being ripe for plundering by the Nazis. For France, the most looted resources were agricultural products and metals. For the Soviet Union, it was agricultural products and oil. For Norway, it was fish and heavy water for the Nazi atomic program. And for Poland, it was its people, with simply unfathomable numbers of Polish citizens being enslaved and put to work in either independent factories, the ghettos, or the concentration camp network. And to try to let you get your head around just how vast the Nazi exploitation of occupied territory was, here are some figures that dictate how much various occupied nations contributed to Nazi Germany per head. For France, it was 955 Reichsmarks. For Norway, it was 2,379. For the Netherlands, 1,667. Bear in mind that the average German industrial salary in the period was about 140 Reichsmarks per month, and, well, you begin to get the idea, don't you? Furthermore, German soldiers were encouraged to send food and other goods home from the countries they were stationed in. Policies were designed to make purchasing goods in conquered countries easy and inexpensive for soldiers, leading to massive shipments of foreign goods to Germany. This included both looted and purchased items, contributing to the transfer of wealth back to Germany. Trade policy, however, even with the uniquely militarized form it took within Nazism, is ultimately just one branch of economic policy. So, what of Nazism's industrial policy? Well, in a nutshell, it was a unique mixed economy approach that had both privatized and nationalized elements, all ultimately controlled by the state to one degree or another, be it direct legislative meddling or with coercive manipulation. The privatized aspect of Nazi industrial policy was a stark divergence from prior Weimar ideas, in which the liberal state was very keen on nationalization and regularly bailed out failing private corporations to attempt to preserve jobs and economic growth, or sometimes simply just buying up enterprises it deemed important or useful. The Nazis reversed this the moment they came to power, immediately listing basically the whole lot for sale. Now, the rationale for this mass privatization was twofold. Firstly, it raised a hell of a lot of capital, which was direly needed given the party's grand plan to transform Germany, and secondly, it was a clever way to reward the many industrialists who had supported them during their rise to power, while also giving them a reason to maintain loyalty, i.e. start having naughty opinions and we're going to take away the wealth that we gave you. To help you get an impression of just how big this privatization effort was, here are just a few of the companies the Nazis sold off from various sectors. In the railways, there was Deutsche Reichsbahn, the single largest public enterprise in the world at the time. It controlled all of Germany's railways and was sold off for 224 million Reichsmarks. In mining, there was Gelsenkirchen Bergbau, a mega mining company that controlled most coal mining in Upper Silesia. It was sold off for just over 100 million Reichsmarks. In banking, Commerzbank, a significant commercial investment bank based in Frankfurt, was sold off for 57 million Reichsmarks. In shipbuilding, Deutsche Schiff- und Maschinenbau AG, a conglomerate that owned 9 shipyards across Germany, was sold off for 3.6 million Reichsmarks. As for the companies that operated those ships, Hamburg Südamerika, which unsurprisingly, given its name, operated out of Hamburg to all over the American continent, was sold off for 8.2 million Reichsmarks. However, Nazi industrial policy wasn't merely about privatization. The regime was also keen on setting up state enterprises to fill in the gaps left by the private sector, a policy Feder dubbed Gesamtwirtschaft, or total economy. This autarky-adjacent idea was simple enough. Germany should be able to make everything, and it would be foolish to depend on the private sector to deliver such a capability. A prime example of this would be Hermann Goering Werke, a sprawling enterprise under the command of its titular Nazi that would grow to encompass everything from tiny little independent garment manufacturers in rural towns to giant steel mills in Germany's industrial heartlands and, well, just about everything in between. Beyond that, the Nazis also devised a cunning strategy of offering non-negotiable, lucrative contracts to private firms. These contracts were so financially enticing that refusing them was not a viable option for most companies, yet they left little room for negotiation. This clever maneuver combined the best of both worlds as far as the Nazis were concerned. They got their big cash injection from selling off companies en masse and could still coerce them to do what they wanted in much the same way as they could with a state enterprise. There was now just someone getting insanely rich in the middle of it all. Through these means, Nazi economics orchestrated a delicate balance of privatization, state enterprise, and coercive control, creating an industrial sector that was ostensibly mostly private, but in truth was a tightly controlled cog in the larger machinery of the state. This approach, while arguably economically astute, was deeply entwined with the broader and, let's be blunt, evil goals of the regime, showing that when it came to Nazism, even something as benign as economics couldn't be separated from the fanatical racialism that guided its every step. And speaking of the intrinsic connection between racialism and economics in Nazism, let's now move on to look at the ideology's idea when it came to welfare. At face value, the Nazi welfare system was very generous, but it was doled out along strict racial lines that after our earlier Nazi racialism chapter you can probably easily guess for yourself. Yes, Aryans got it, and the Untermensch didn't. That was the general rule anyway. In order to dole out welfare to those deemed worthy, a vast network of party and party-adjacent organizations were established, chief among which was National Socialist People's Welfare, or NSV, an originally in-party organization established in 1931 that was then expanded into a nationwide bureaucracy when they came to power. But even to those who were deemed worthy, organizations such as these were far from altruistic, as yes, they did dole out generous benefits, but they were also tools for disseminating Nazi propaganda and making the populace dependent on the party, both of which would help cement its grip on power. As for specific benefits the NSV doled out, that included the operation of day nurseries, funding holiday homes for mothers, distributing additional food for large families, things like that. Further to organizations like the NSV were charity drives such as Winter Hilfswerk or Winter Relief Work. This was an enormous annual drive that was first ordered and personally launched by Hitler in 1933. It collected money in much the same way as you would imagine a modern charity doing so, with money tins on the streets around Germany, but unlike a modern charity, donation was not exactly optional. No one was going to put a gun to your head and make you scurry in your pockets for change, admittedly, but they were pushy, to say the least. And with every Nazi government body being obligated to send some of its staff on the drives, even the militarized ones such as the SA, SS, and Gestapo, the people shaking the tin in your face could often be rather intimidating types. As time went on and Nazi indoctrination set in, such pushy tactics eventually became moot, as the mere threat of social suicide if they abstained was usually more than enough to encourage donations. All in all, the scheme raised an insane amount of money. And look, we don't have exact figures all to the end of the war, but we do know that it raised over 1 billion Reichsmarks come 1937, all of which went straight into the pockets of the NSV. Also within the umbrella of welfare is Nazism's attitudes toward trade unionism, because when they came to power, all trade unions were flatly banned and replaced instead by the Deutsche Arbeitersfront. That's the German Labour Front, or DAF. This was a singular labour body that was under the direct control of the party. Ostensibly, it existed to defend workers' rights, much like a conventional union, and it did indeed do this. But of course, because this is Nazism we're talking about here, there was a significant cloud attached to that silver lining, because the DAF also functioned as a body to shape and control a German worker's entire life, by making them subservient to the state for their rights, being a point of contact for indoctrination measures, and dangling a few juicy carrots in front of their faces to make them submit. An example of how the DAF balanced this delicate trichotomy of control was through schemes such as Kraft durch Freude, or Strength Through Joy, KDF. This was, simplifying it a touch, a welfare initiative operated by the DAF that gave them access to various state-subsidized amenities and opportunities that normally would have been completely beyond their means, with an example being holidays both domestically and abroad. Now, naturally, lots of workers were keen to make full use of this, and so the DAF invested an ungodly amount of money into building facilities for KDF, with notable examples being Prora, an enormous vacation and leisure complex built at a cost of 237 million Reichsmarks that had the capacity to service just under 2 million residential holidaymakers and 7 million day trippers a year at max capacity. As for foreign holidays, the DAF commissioned a fleet of cruise ships that it put to sea under the KDF banner, with notable examples being the MV Wilhelm Gustloff and MV Robert Ley. Both of these ships sailed all around Europe, taking holidaymakers to exotic locales such as Crete and Cyprus in the Mediterranean, and Norway and Sweden up in Scandinavia. Beyond just holidays, KDF also ran other schemes to boost the living standards of the work, with notable examples being the Schönheit der Arbeit, or Beauty of Labor, which was a straightforward scheme aimed at improving working conditions in factories by improving cleanliness, air quality, and the aesthetics of the workplace, and the Volkswagen, or People's Car program, which had the aim of producing a car for every Aryan family in Germany. And yes, if you happen to be wondering, it is that Volkswagen, the very same Volkswagen that dominates car manufacturing today. Yeah, it was founded by the KDF in 1937 to produce and market the Volkswagen Type 1, which, after the war, we'd all start calling the Beetle. Note, however, unlike the other welfare schemes that we've discussed thus far, Volkswagen was a total failure. Only a few Type 1s were produced before its facilities were given over to war manufacturing, with even those few being gobbled up by party elites and not finding their way to the people. As far as discussions on Nazism go, this discussion on welfare has been surprisingly positive. So before we move on to the final aspect of Nazi economics that we're going to discuss today, let us come back to a point we made at the beginning of the discussion and have hinted at throughout, and one that is worth saying explicitly, just to be safe here. Nazi welfare was only offered to Aryans, so while it may have a deceptively positive veneer, it is just as hate-filled and regressive as the rest of Nazi ideology. Now, look, we know 99.99% of you would have got that, but would far rather overstate a point this important rather than understate it. You're welcome. Further to this, don't forget that all of those posh benefits and schemes were funded either partly or in full by the oppression of the Untermensch. They had their property stolen, their bank accounts and businesses seized. They were made slaves, all to fund these benefits. So please don't come away from this discussion with the impression that Nazi welfare ideas were in any way good. They weren't. And with that said, let's look at one final aspect of Nazi economics: monetary policy. In a nutshell, the aim was to come up with innovative ways of raising capital while desperately avoiding tax rises and the political backlash that came with them. The linchpin of this approach was the MEFO bill, a highly ingenious yet highly deceptive financial instrument. And I mean, come on, this is Nazism. We are deep enough into the video now to know well that we never find anything good without there being a catch. But what was a MEFO bill, we hear you cry? Well, to put it simply, an MEFO bill was a promissory note, an IOU if you will. They were invented to be a clever workaround to traditional methods of government financing. They worked roughly like this. The government wanted a thing, and rather than paying cash as per tradition, they gave one of these MEFO bills, legally binding, well, as legally binding as anything was in Nazi Germany anyway, promise a future payment that could be redeemed for Reichsmarks at any time within 5 years of issuing. But the clever detail, the entire time it wasn't claimed, it was accruing interest at a rate of 4%. The gamble was that the capitalists of the Reich wouldn't be able to say no to that cheeky bit of extra profit on top, and thus would delay claiming it for as long as possible, giving the Nazi government time to grow the economy and raise funds through other means, a gamble that by and large did prove accurate. Despite all of that, however, MEFO bills had a fatal flaw. If the Nazi state hadn't managed to grow the economy sufficiently to be able to raise the taxes needed to pay off all of these IOUs by the time they were eventually claimed, they would be up shit creek without a paddle. And that is exactly what happens. The German economic miracle, as so many are keen to call it, wasn't a miracle at all. It was a charade and a facade. A whole nation effectively living on credit card debt. But fortunately for the Nazis, they were spared from complete economic collapse by World War II, which gave the regime no end of plundered resources that it could use to clear its debts, and if they got caught out, well, a little visit from the Gestapo usually sorted things out, didn't it? In that respect, World War II saved the Nazi economy. Had the Poles handed over Danzig, the British not issued that guarantee of Polish independence, or any number of things that could have prevented the outbreak and spread of World War II, then the Nazi economy would have completely imploded. And rather than being remembered as economic geniuses for some reason, they'd be remembered as bumbling dotes on par with Robert Mugabe. Nazi gender views. According to Nazi ideology, women were not free and independent agents. No, like everyone else, they were but cogs in the national machine, with their role being a very specific one: to breed, both in the literal pumping out of babies for the Führer and fatherland sense, and in the more abstract nurturing the nation sense. Like everything else in Nazism, this was of course done through a racialized lens, and how a woman happened to fall in the racial hierarchy that guided the country would in turn affect what was expected of her as a mother. For Aryan mothers, they were to be baby factories in the truest sense of the word, and from a young age they would be prepared for this task, both physically and mentally. For Untermensch mothers, by contrast, it was believed they should be discouraged or prevented from having children altogether, and of course they also believed that the Untermensch should not be breeding with the Aryans. As we already saw back in the part about Nazi racialism, race and gender therefore are completely inseparable and totally intertwined in Nazi ideology. But to really get our heads around this, let's take a two-pronged approach in this chapter, one in which we will firstly look at the ideological side of Nazi gender views to learn what they actually believed and why, and then take a look at how these ideas were put into practice once the Nazis assumed power in 1933. Hitler outlined the basic position in a speech he gave to the National Socialist Women's League, the women's branch of the party, in September 1934, in which he said, quoting, "The sacrifices which the man makes in the struggle of his nation, the woman makes in the preservation of that nation in individual cases. What the man gives in courage on the battlefield, the woman gives in eternal self-sacrifice, in eternal pain and suffering. Every child that a woman brings into the world is a battle waged for the existence of her people. And both must therefore mutually value and respect each other when they see that each performs the task that nature and providence have ordained. And this mutual respect will necessarily result from the separation of the functions of each." From this, the message was clear. Men and women, on account of their fundamentally different physiologies and psychologies, find themselves with fundamentally different but supposedly equal roles to play in Nazi society. But Hitler was far from the only Nazi thinker to comment on women, so before we zoom in on what that different role was for women according to Nazi ideology, let us have a look at what other thinkers had to say to get an appreciation of the general regressive attitude towards women in Nazism. Some, like Alfred Rosenberg, didn't even attempt to hide their sexism behind a pseudo-intellectual veneer and were perfectly open about their attitude, as evidenced by the following extract from The Myth of the 20th Century that summed up his views perfectly, quoting, "Emotion is fit only for women in drawing rooms." Given that patronizing view of women, then, it's fair to say that Rosenberg wasn't exactly a feminist, a fact that he freely admitted later in the book, with a good bit of anti-Semitism and nationalism mixed in for good measure, quoting again, "The demand for equal political rights for women was the natural consequence of the ideas of the French Revolution. These rights were promoted by liberal so-called human rights philosophies. The emancipation of the Jews followed from the preaching of the insane idea of human equality. So also was the case with the liberation of women from male slavery. The demand for present-day female emancipation was raised in the name of boundless individualism, not in the name of a new synthesis. In the sense of living to the full, the moment was then interpreted accordingly by its adherents. As a reinforcement of this demand came the shaping of the social situation through world trade and over-industrialization. Women were forced to assist their men in the factories in order to maintain the life of their family. The entry of women into the workforce lowered the man's wages. As a result, the period of bachelorhood was unnaturally lengthened. This increased the number of unmarried, marriageable women. In turn, this led to the increase of prostitution. Note, however, that while Rosenberg was evidently much more openly sexist than Hitler, he did also come back to the idea that women had a different role to play in society than men. He just didn't happen to pretend that it was some kind of supposedly lofty, separate but equal type position. This ultimately would be the defining characteristic of Nazism's attitude towards women and gender equality. But before we dive into the specifics of how that translated into real-world policy, let's look at what a few other key Nazis had to say on women, just to really drive this general position home. And we'll begin with Joseph Goebbels, who said the following during a speech in 1929, quoting, "The mission of women is to be beautiful and to bring children into the world. This is not at all as unmodern as it sounds. The female bird preens herself for a mate and hatches eggs for him. In exchange, the male takes care of gathering food and stands guard and wards off the enemy." Now, that was an interesting hors d'oeuvres for sure, as we could straight away see that Goebbels subscribed to the same pretend sexism is a good thing mantra as Hitler did, rather than the unmasked and fragrant variety that Rosenberg subscribed to. But to see his position in greater depth, let's now look at a speech that he made in 1933, in which he said, quote, "Although I agree that men make history, I do not forget that women raise boys to manhood. We have kept women out of the parliamentary democratic intrigues of the past 14 years in Germany, not because we do not respect them, but because we respect them too much. We do not see the woman as inferior, but rather as having a different mission, a different value than that of the man." Therefore, we believe that the German woman, who more than any other in the world is a woman in the best sense of the word, should use her strength and abilities in other areas than the man. The woman has always been not only the man's sexual companion, but also his fellow worker. Long ago, she did heavy labor with the man in the field. She moved with him into the cities, entering the offices and factories, doing her share of the work for which she was best suited. She did this with all her abilities, her loyalty, her selfless devotion, her readiness to sacrifice. The woman in public life today is no different than the woman of the past, but it must also be said that those things that belong to the man must remain his. The quote ends. The pretend sexism is a good thing perspective, or at least claimed perspective, of Hitler and Goebbels was the predominant one among Nazi thought leaders. And to demonstrate that, let's now move on to look at Rudolf Hess's view, as he also sang from that same song sheet. His position is laid out by this extract from Rudolf Hess Speaks, a published collection of his speeches from the 1930s, quoting, "We do not want to forget the mothers, women, and children who gave their dearest, often their provider, and bear their fate with quiet heroism. The battle-ready manly heroes and the quiet sacrifices of mothers and women are holy examples of loyalty for us Germans. The flags that we now raise once more are the symbols of this loyalty, which for Nordic mankind is closely bound to heroism. Loyalty not only in deed, but in character." We won't delve any deeper with Hess as we did previously. We know how this standard Nazi perspective works by now, and Hess is no different. Women being confined to the home and pumping out kids is a good thing actually, and we love you for it. Cheers for giving us sons to die in the war. So, now that we have firmly established the typical Nazi view of women by looking at Hitler, Goebbels, and Hess, and also seen more extreme, or rather more honest perspectives by looking at Rosenberg, let's now have a look at one more extreme example, just to establish that while very much in the minority, Rosenberg was far from the only Nazi bigwig who said the quiet part out loud when it came to women. Specifically, let's look at Ernst Röhm, who freely admitted his flagrant misogyny in the following extract from his memoirs, quoting, "Since I'm an immature man and a bachelor, women play no role in my life. I despise them too much to be able to say anything good about them." It is fair to say that Röhm, probably more than any other Nazi, really hated women. And as he goes on in his memoir, he continued to make that fact further evident, quoting again, "It cannot be a coincidence that women can obtain privileged positions in this state. Women are to the forefront not only in business, but in political life. With the exception to date of the rural parties, all the others send women as deputies to both parliaments. Mulier tacit, the women should be silent, no longer has validity. Women hold forth and men knuckle under. Yet this equality and submission by men to women is considered very manly today. They make fools of themselves." And just to really drive it home, he also said this: "At the time of national greatness and might, and in times of war, women have never been tolerated in high positions. It is hard to imagine that Alexander the Great, or Frederick the Great, or Caesar, or Napoleon, or Prince Eugen, or Charles VII of Sweden would have bent to their influence. These men were the great warlords of all time, shining examples as leaders of their people. But they were only unvarnished war heroes, and not enlightened rulers of an ideal Reich in beauty and dignity." Naturally, German feminists weren't exactly chuffed with the Nazis' regressive stance on women, and took quite the understandable objection, with key figures who vocalized such criticisms being Anita Augsburg and Lyda Heimann, both prominent politically non-aligned German feminist activists. Both women were heavy critics of Nazism the moment it began to emerge as a meaningful political party. Both women lobbied for Hitler to be expelled from Germany from 1923. Both women organized and led counter-protests and movements as the Nazis continued their rise in prominence throughout the late 1920s and early 1930s, and both women, fearing for their lives, fled to Zurich, Switzerland when the Nazis came to power, and both tragically passed in 1943, never getting to see their countrywomen liberated from the bondage of Nazi regressivism. The Nazis, for their part, had a number of counters to their criticisms. Oftentimes, especially in the early days when Hitler was more open to seizing power through force and cared little for cultivating a civilized image, the main counter to this was violence. Feminist and feminist-aligned counter-protesters being brutally descended upon by the SA brown shirts when belittling and mockery didn't see them move on. But as time went on, particularly after they took power, they were eager to develop that civilized veneer, and so they made attempts to better rationalize their position on women, as shown by the following extract from Hitler himself, taken from his 1935 Party Day speech to the National Socialist Women's League, quoting, "When our opponents say you degrade women by assigning them no other task than that of childbearing, then I answer that it is not degrading to a woman to be a mother. On the contrary, it is her greatest honor. There is nothing nobler for a woman than to be the mother of sons and daughters of the people. This doubling down of the no being stuck at home is actually good for you Nazi view was also parroted by Goebbels, as shown in the following extract from a speech he made in 1933, quoting again. It may be unpopular to say this to an audience of women, but it must be said because it is true and because it helps make clear our attitude toward women. The modern age, with all its vast revolutionary transformations in government, politics, economic and social relations, has not left women and their role in public life untouched. These revolutionary transformations have largely taken from women their proper tasks. Their eyes were set in directions that were not appropriate for them. The result was a distorted public view of German womanhood that had nothing to do with former ideals. The woman is the teacher of the youth and therefore the builder of the foundation of the future. If the family is the nation's source of strength, the woman is its core and center. They use their strength, their abilities, their sense of responsibility for the nation in other ways. We are convinced, however, that the first task of a socially reformed nation must be to again give the woman the possibility to fulfill her real task, her mission in the family, and as a mother. So now that we have a solid grounding in the people and perspectives that guided Nazi gender views, we're now in a great position to move on and see how it all manifested as policy in the real world. But before we do that, let's just clarify one important point about what we just discussed. Like we noted when we looked at Nazi racial views, there was no unifying codex that dictated their gender position from the top down, in just the same way that racialism was shaped by competing ideas all being hit out of the same foundational ballpark and the political capital of their espouses. So too were gender views. Just something to bear in mind as we move forward. One of the first implementations of Nazism's gender views in the real world was the marriage loan program. Initiated in 1933 by the Law for the Reduction of Unemployment, it was a scheme aimed to encourage childbirth. It offered interest-free loans of 1,000 Reichsmarks, an amount equivalent to just under 7 months' pay, as don't forget, the average German worker then took home roughly 140 Reichsmarks a month. The loans themselves were provided not in cash, but in the form of vouchers in the husband's name, which could be redeemed for a plethora of household and consumer goods at retailers across Germany. And of course, because we're talking about Nazism here, it goes without saying that the loans were only available to Aryan families. But how did this encourage families to have more children, we hear you ask? Surely many families would just pocket the vouchers and crack on as they were. Well, the Nazis thought about that, and so a condition was added to the loan. Upon receipt, the wife must immediately leave the workforce unless the husband earned less than 125 Reichsmarks a month. Then, being at home and free from those tiring shackles of the workplace, the wife would naturally want to do what husband and wife do best, with renewed vigor, thereby pumping out a load of kids. Happy days. Or, well, so the idea went anyway. The repayment terms were also fixed to bring about the Nazis' desired outcome. Couples with both partners working had to repay at a rate of 3% per month, but if only the husband worked, the rate was 1% a month, thereby disincentivizing families from finding ways to blag around the demands to leave work. Furthermore, a quarter of the loan was forgiven for each child born. This naturally further incentivized having larger families, squeeze out 4 kids, and you get your new telly for free. So keen were the Germans for new tellies, in fact, that a baby boom occurred in Germany in the 1930s, and a colloquial term developed for children born to see the loan waived, Abkindern, which roughly translates as pay off children. The scheme was a big hit with the German people, and by the end of 1938, over 1 million loans had been forgiven. It also had some economic benefits. Removing such a large amount of people from the workforce allowed the Nazis to blag that they had reached full employment, and the retail sector also saw a significant boom from the sudden explosive demand for household goods. But we're not going to stress too much about that. It is the gender implications of the policy that we're most bothered about in this chapter. A scheme such as this was naturally expensive. So how did they pay for it? You're no doubt asking. Well, they didn't. Not really. And the scheme was run at a loss to the state. There were some attempts to claw back some Reichsmarks with a new tax on unmarried individuals, which was levied on those under 55 who were liable to pay income tax, but the money it yielded was a bonus. What this tax really meant to do was encourage Hans to get on one knee for Helga so that they could dodge paying it. But the marriage loan program was just one of many schemes that the Nazis came up with to see their gender ideals realized, with another example being the infamous Lebensborn program. Translating as fount of life, Lebensborn was a scheme aimed at increasing Aryan birth rates through the provision of welfare to predominantly unmarried mothers who ticked all of the Aryan genetic boxes, including but not limited to direct financial aid, medical care, as well as state-funded childbirth, childcare, and adoption facilities, including maternity facilities where the aforementioned Aryan mothers could give birth anonymously. It was initiated in 1935 by Heinrich Himmler and began small scale, focusing just on SS officers and their families, before eventually expanding out to cover most of Germany and eventually Germany's occupied territories once World War II broke out. The aim of all of that was straightforward enough: to encourage casual sexual encounters and impulsive pregnancy decisions amongst Aryan youth, as now, when Hans and Helga were in the throes of passionate Oktoberfest or whatever else it is that German teenagers did back in those days, Helga wouldn't have to worry about the societal shame, financial pressures, or health risks that normally would have come from such a casual encounter, because now old Uncle Heinrich would be there to look after her when the consequences of that encounter came a-knocking. He was just such a great guy, and it had absolutely nothing to do with him wanting to manipulate Aryan youth into being willing participants in the Nazi baby factory. It absolutely wasn't that. Not at all. Oh, and if you're thinking that all of that stands in rather stark contrast to the whole veneration of motherhood thing that those leading Nazis earlier in the chapter tried to claim, well, yeah, you're right. But hey, this is a video about Nazis. Rampant hypocrisy is kind of the name of the game here. And if you thought all of that was dark, well, you haven't seen nothing yet, because there was another much darker way that Lebensborn helped to create kids for the cause. And that's that it stole them, wholesale. This particularly dark turn in the story began in 1939 when Lebensborn started expanding into Germany's various subjugated territories, with kidnappings having been documented in Yugoslavia, Poland, the Soviet Union, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Estonia, Latvia, and Norway. The process by which they did it wasn't subtle either. Allgemeine SS staff posted to Lebensborn would prowl these territories on the hunt for Aryan children, and when they found one that they thought fit the bill, they'd take it. Sometimes it was done subtly, parents being given an envelope full of notes and 5 minutes to say their goodbyes, and other times it was done far more flagrantly at pistol point. It all just depended on how unhinged the SS man was feeling on that particular day. The children were then taken to a local Lebensborn facility, where they were calmed down, as they were usually screaming and bailing their eyes out at that point, and then administered a series of tests designed to deduce how easily they could be indoctrinated to becoming good little National Socialists. Then, by the results of those tests, they would be sorted into one of three categories: desirable, acceptable, and unwanted. Following this, the children of the former two groups were placed with Aryan foster families if they were between the ages of 2 and 6, and those older than 6 were sent to boarding schools back in Germany. All of the children, no matter how old, were given new German names and had all documents pertaining to their old life destroyed. As for the unwanted children, they were sent straight to a concentration camp to be worked to death. Ultimately, we have no idea how many children were kidnapped by Lebensborn, with estimates by historians ranging from anywhere from 20,000 to 200,000. Beyond those various coercive schemes, the Nazis also made attempts to venerate motherhood in order to promote happy and willing childbirth amongst Aryans, a prime example of which is the Cross of Honor of the German Mother, the civilian medal that was awarded to Aryan mothers for industrially pumping out kids. It was awarded from 1938 to 1945 and came in 3 exponentially more prestigious classes: bronze, silver, and gold, which denoted the award as having had 4, 6, and 8 children respectively. As for its exclusivity for Aryans, this was taken very seriously by the Nazis, and no bureaucratic effort was wasted to make sure that it only found its way to those ethnically eligible, with vast proportions of the state's bureaucratic apparatus, specifically the Social Welfare Agency, Public Health Department, Youth Welfare Agency, police, and even the Gestapo, all dedicating vast amounts of workers to the task of investigating the ethnic makeup of every single prospective awardee. In addition to just their ethnic backgrounds, checks were also carried out on the moral character of the awardee, i.e. making sure they weren't harboring any naughty opinions and that none of the births being totted up were stillbirths. The medal didn't just represent a simple pat on the back from the Nazi machine either, as it came with some very real benefits, both social and financial. Those awarded it would suddenly find themselves able to access the best material luxuries that Nazi Germany had to offer: housing, food, clothing, and schooling. They got the best of it all. Furthermore, a mother wearing the medal, or known to have been awarded it, would suddenly find that she never had to stand on a bus, was always ushered to the front of every queue, and was always allowed to grab the last tin of strudel in the grocery store. Even members of the Hitler Youth were ordered to salute awardees of the medal as though they were saluting a superior officer. And side note, we're only zooming in on the Nazi nation in this episode when it's directly relevant to the ideology and its implementation. But yeah, the speed and extent with which the Nazis indoctrinated Germany to get on board with their wacky ideas is kind of terrifying, as you can see. As for how many of these medals were awarded before the Nazi Empire came crumbling down, we have no idea. The documents containing that information didn't survive the mass paper burnings at the end of World War II, but from one surviving document that states that 4.7 million women were awarded it in various grades by late 1941, we know for sure that a huge number of them were given out. But in addition to schemes such as the Cross of Honor, which were obviously aimed at getting adult women on side, the Nazis also had various schemes aimed at indoctrinating German girls into being loyal wives, mothers, and above all else, National Socialists. Primarily, this was done through the use of youth organizations, chief among which was the League of German Girls, or BDM. Founded in 1930 under the leadership of Balder von Schirach and later passing into the control of Trude Moore and Jutta Rüdiger, the BDM focused on a strict regime of physical, moral, and ideological training. Its members were subdivided into 3 separate age stratifications: the Jung Madelbund, or Young Girls Association, for girls aged 10 to 14, the BDM proper for girls aged 14 to 17, and the Glaub und Schönheit, or Faith and Beauty, for girls aged 17 to 21. The BDM as a whole was founded in 1930 as the female youth wing of the Nazi Party, but was later made the official and indeed only female youth organization in 1934, before membership then became compulsory in 1936. Activities were largely the same across all these groups: gymnastics and athletics to make them fit for childbearing, domestic training in skills such as cooking and sewing to make them fit for wifely duties, and various games and fun activities with political undertones to indoctrinate them into National Socialism. Now, I should stress too that contrary to how you might be, understandably, imagining the BDM as a cohort of reluctant and hesitant teenage girls being compelled at gunpoint to partake in a nutty ideology, the reality of the organizations is actually the exact opposite, and the vast majority of girls seem to have greatly enjoyed their time in the organization. Primarily, this was due to a clever emphasis on making the group enjoyable above all else. Emphasis was placed on camaraderie, playing adult, and above all else, fun, rather than making it a Clockwork Orange-esque open indoctrination factory. A spoonful of sugar to help the medicine go down. This made the BDM damn effective as an indoctrination machine. So much so that come 1945, as the Nazi Empire was falling apart at the seams, BDM girls and young women who had undergone over a decade of indoctrination by that point were conscripted into the military. They served typically in auxiliary roles, spotters, stretcher bearers, medics, and the like, but some were even put to work serving in combat roles, mostly on anti-aircraft guns, but some were even loaded up with Panzerfaust rocket launchers and sent out tank hunting, and these BDM troops were among some of the last to surrender in Berlin, right alongside the most ideologically fanatical SS troops. But what of the Untermensch and Mischling women? How were they treated? Or rather, how badly were they treated? Because you know full well it's not going to be good, don't you? Well, the persecution they faced was both severe and multifaceted, with its root deep in the racialist and sexist theories that we're now fully acquainted with. To begin with, when the Nazis operated a kind of American-esque racially segregated system, Jewish women immediately found themselves cut off from all welfare and benefits, were encouraged to stay in the workplace, and given free and ready access to abortion, all in stark contrast to Aryan women. From there, things only got worse as the Nazi machine got into higher gear. The free and ready access to abortion was eventually supplemented by sterilization, which in the vast majority of cases was done without the woman's knowledge or consent, either through the administering of chemical castration under the guise of other legitimate medical treatments, or in the most extreme cases by being dragged off the street and told nothing about the procedure they were undergoing. Eventually, with the beginning of ghettoization in 1939, things escalated further still. What little attempt had been made to keep up a legitimate facade on the Nazis' treatment of minority women completely ceased, and they found themselves fully enslaved, living lives that consisted of wanton squalor in fenced-off, chronically overcrowded, and abjectly filthy slums, working back-breaking labor from sun-up till sundown every single day. As for pregnancy, if they were lucky, really lucky, they'd be allowed to carry it to term, and if they were unlucky, they'd be pinned down and forcibly have it aborted by a doctor. Not that that distinction really mattered in the cruel reality of a ghetto, as such conditions rarely facilitated a live birth anyway. 1939 also saw the start of mass efforts to transport Jewish women to the camp system, either a concentration camp where they'd be slowly worked to death over time, or a death camp where they were disposed of almost immediately. This also saw another cruelty added to their life: human experimentation, as Jewish women were forced to partake in horrific experiments, with examples being forced to engage in sexual activity with strangers as a potential cure for hypothermia, having various experimental fertility treatments injected into their ovaries without anesthetic, and being raped in order to track the travel of seminal fluid in their reproductive system. As a result of all of this, over 2 million Jewish women would perish as a result of Nazism. As for the other groups of minority women demonized by Nazism, their treatment was much the same. Nazism saw them all as equally worthless. Exact numbers for the amount of other non-Jewish minority women killed by the Nazis is hard to come by, but it appears to be many, many millions. We'd say that they were treated like animals, but that wouldn't be correct. Animals actually had rights in Nazi Germany. And so our deep dive on Nazi ideology comes to an end. There's a lot of things that we didn't discuss in this piece, as this wasn't intended to be a digital university lecture on the matter per se, but rather a bit of a springboard for some upcoming videos we have planned that are intended to give you a grasp on the core ideas that will be the most pertinent going forward. Anything we haven't discussed? Don't worry, it's coming, and will likely get its own dedicated video. If you find yourself longing to know more, and let's face it, why wouldn't you? Because while undoubtedly grim and morbid, the sheer absurdity of Nazism and the society it created make it a fascinating thing to study. I'd like to recommend 3 things that you can do. Firstly, you can stay tuned to this channel because, as we say, more videos on Nazism are coming, and we will eventually pull apart every single detail about it in great depth. Secondly, you can head to the primary sources yourself. All of the works we cited today are freely available both in digital and physical format. But should you do this, do be warned, many of these texts are outright banned in certain territories, with Mein Kampf alone being banned in Austria, Guatemala, and Russia, to name just a few. Double check and be careful before you start stuffing your shelves. Also, be careful where you buy them from, as there's no nice way to say this, there are several outright neo-Nazi publishers out there that distribute these texts for, well, less than scholarly reasons, shall we say. If you're in doubt, buy secondhand through reputable mainstream distributors. And also, one thing we should add while we're on the matter of primary sources, just remember these are works of fundamental propaganda. Just keep yourself in check and keep level when you read them. Finally, you can check out some decent scholarly works to expand your knowledge, and we've got some cracking historians to recommend. First up, Ian Kershaw. He's written an insane number of books on Nazism over the years, but Hitler, a lengthy and detailed biography of the man, and the Nazi dictatorship problems and perspectives of interpretation is a large historical retrospective. These are great places to start. Beyond Kershaw, The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich by William Shirer is also a fantastic read. He focuses more on geopolitics than ideology, but it's still a very well-researched and interesting book. Then there's The German Dictatorship by Karl Dietrich Bracher, and that's also worth checking out. He has a particular focus on the machinations of the state after the Nazis came to power, and is absolutely worth a read. But, of course, we hope you picked the first option first and foremost, and we look forward to seeing you again in the next installment.